Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to take part in celebrating Hugo's very long and distinguished career. And Hugo's made contributions in so many dimensions, in scholarly research, as a teacher of undergraduates and graduate students, as a journal editor, and in other kinds of service to the profession, as a university administrator, and service to the kind of academic excellence around the world. He's done a lot of globetrotting. Now, many people in this audience know more than I do about Hugo's scholarly accomplishments, so I won't even try to talk about that. And I see that a lot of you were his students, so I'm not going to talk about him as a teacher. And instead, I'll say a little bit about Hugo as a colleague. So I'll say as a member of the Department of Economics, Hugo has been a wonderful leader, and a leader by example in two dimensions that I often feel get kind of neglected. So kind of citizenship and civility. So when the department, and this was after he'd served as president, comes back to the department as just, Professor Sunshine, we needed a chairman. And Hugo kind of stepped forward and agreed to take the position. And he wasn't just a caretaker chairman. He did a great job. He did some good recruiting that year. He really wanted to, have an influence on the department. A few years later, when, we needed a director of graduate studies, like before anybody else, I think, even realized that we needed somebody, Hugo volunteered for the job. And I'll say even more than those two tasks, like just his presence at faculty meetings has been wonderful. I don't know about faculty meetings elsewhere. Ours are, it kind of reminds you of, like 6-year-olds in a battle on the playground. And Hugo he's not only brought, great arguments and reasoning to our faculty meetings, he's brought a level of civility, which I would say is rare. I'm so sorry more of my colleagues aren't here, because you may know this. We all could use a lesson, I guess. Okay, but let's.
Sometimes late though.
But let's turn to our panel. So we have Al Roth, Roger Meyerson, Ariel Rubenstein, and Lars Hansen. Andrea Mascalé, unfortunately, can't join us. He wrote on Wednesday saying that due to a political crisis, he'd be talking to Parliament in Spain rather than to us. And I say it's bad luck all around, because we'll miss him, and I'm sure he would rather be here. So we're going to start with not too long opening statements from each of our panelists. And then open the floor for discussion. My own role is going to be simply to prevent mayhem if the arguments get disorderly, or provoke a little friction if they're too agreeable. Okay, so the panelists were offered a kind of something to stimulate their creative process. And I hear this is actually from Hugo. And I'll read it just so that you know what the panel, they were also told they could just range out from this and ignore it if they wanted to. But anyway, I'll read the topic that they were offered. And that's, here we go. So the introduction of mathematics and, quote, the more formal approach has helped to advance economics over the past 50 to 75 years. It has clearly influenced your own work and the work of many of the conference participants. From von Neumann to Nash, from Arrow, De Breuer, and McKenzie, papers have been written which have changed the face of economics. But economics is not applied mathematics. Statistics has flourished, computer science has been born, biology and psychology have become very different disciplines, and the economic and political worlds seem ever more integrated. We are flooded with data. In this very different world, what comes next? What excites you? What is important and doable? Is formalism at the current level here to stay? Will new methods and approaches be introduced that could again change the face of economics? Okay, so Al will lead off.
Okay, so what comes next? How are we going to follow Hugo, who even from a distance, the professional distance, I never worked with Hugo, but it's clear that he's been both an exemplary scholar and an exemplary teacher. And so how are we going to follow that? What's going to come next? Well, those of you who know some of my work won't be surprised that I think that one part of the future will be a kind of economic engineering that we're just beginning to explore now, and that so far is going under the name of market design, but that might prove to be too limiting a name for what's coming. But it'll cause us to think both about what kind of questions we ask and how we answer them, and what kind of literature we foster to promote those kinds of questions and answers. And again, in terms of what the name will be, when I wrote an article called The Economist as Engineer some years ago, I put out the name Design Economics, which certainly hasn't caught on. And I'm proud to defend market design as a good name, but that's not necessarily how engineering will develop. So I thought the way I would talk about how economic engineering looks is to look at a Chicago economist and some of his work. So Eric Budish isn't here today because he's at a market design conference at the NBER in Cambridge. I think he may be here tomorrow. But let me tell you a little about his work and about some of the different parts it has and how they fit together in a way that makes them a kind of engineering and not just economic theory. So he wrote a series of papers. They didn't come out in the order in which they were written, but the first one was a detailed analysis of the way courses were assigned at the Harvard Business School. So that was looking at an existing institution and seeing the strategic issues that it raised for participants and how they dealt with them. So it was far from a strategy-proof mechanism, and that affected the way MBA students who are eager to look for things that aren't strategy-proof and how you might improve your position, how they dealt with Harvard and how they got their second-year courses. So having identified the flaws in an existing system that was quite similar to flaws in the systems of course allocation in many places, he went on to think about how you might attack the combinatorial assignment problem of assigning people not individual objects, but sets of objects, right? When you're getting assigned your courses as a second-year MBA student, you want a set of courses, and that's a complicated thing, and everyone else wants an equally complicated object, so it's a hard problem. And he came up with a very Chicago kind of solution, which was approximate competitive equilibrium in a market that would really make the incentives work properly for that. What he observed is that many universities, including, I believe, Chicago Booth at the time, and maybe still, had bidding systems that were in artificial money. And those had the property that, although you could prove theorems about them that looked like competitive equilibrium, in an actual competitive equilibrium with real money, you don't mind going home with some money. But going home with the points that you were allowed to bid on courses without having the courses is not nearly as satisfying. So there are real flaws in mechanisms that simply have you bid in a budget of artificial money. Anyway, he wrote a wonderful theory paper addressed at this difficult practical issue. Then he proposed that this was, in fact, a practical system, and where he got traction was at Wharton, where his classmate Judd Kessler was working. And Judd is an experimental economist, and together, as part of the process of convincing the deans at Wharton to make a radical change in their course allocation system, they did an experiment. And the experiment was for a couple of things. One was to make sure the particular software they designed was usable and things like that. But the other is there are issues that you have to address that aren't easily addressed in theory. When Eric was writing his approximate competitive equilibrium model, having people express their preferences wasn't hard. They would choose the choice bundle they liked best that they could afford with their budget, as one does in a theory paper. But of course, those preferences are very complicated objects. They're preferences over sets of classes that can have substitutabilities and complementarities and scheduling issues. So So in the software that they built a simplified language, and one of the reasons they did experiments was to test its usability and whether it adequately represented the preferences that MBA students had. So the experiment was an important part of the process of implementation. And then after it had been successfully implemented, they've now written a paper about the implementation, about the computational problems. It turns out you do lots of parallel computation to assign courses at Wharton these days, many calls of integer programming solvers. And so they talk about that, and they talk about the data from the early uses, the first uses. And they say a couple of interesting things. One is a critical feature for the success of course match is its strategy-proof property. It's strategy-proof in the large, an idea that Eric has also helped pursue. And a theoretical idea that came up from the practical problems of implementing an allocation mechanism on this scale. And the other thing they say we don't claim that the course match computational architecture is optimal. Indeed, an important question left for future research is whether there are better ways to do this. So one of the points I want to make is that, well, 2 points I want to make. One is that the details matter and that this isn't market design isn't a method, it's a problem, and you approach it through lots of methods. And the other is that engineering solutions don't last forever. We get better at them, and we're not trying to build the Sphinx that will last forever. We're trying to build better solutions today and find better ones in the future. So let me enlarge on a couple of these points just for a few minutes. One of the things that Eric had to deal with in practice that we don't really have to deal with very much in theory is how to elicit and assess preferences. Right? In a theoretical model, people can have complicated preferences, but they choose what they want when they get a choice. But of course, if you have to ask them for their preferences themselves may be high-dimensional combinatorial objects. In kidney exchange, the work that I have been doing for some time and I'm still doing, we've had to deal with that. And we've made progress in assessing surgeons' preferences. What we do in kidney exchange is we propose particular transplants. We say, here's a set of transplants, a matching, and some kidneys should go to some people. And so an offer is a transplant, an edge in a compatibility graph. And in 2007, although we had all these nice optimization results and some incentive results, what we found is only about 15% of offers were resulting in transplants. And that's partly because if you propose a three-way cycle and the surgeon for the patient in pair 3 rejects this one, then the whole cycle fails. But part of it was we didn't understand and we couldn't elicit the preferences of the surgeons that were causing them to reject some transplants. And we've made some progress in that, which has been important in implementing kidney exchange. And so what was going on was, one of the things that was going on was that surgeons were rejecting kidneys that were compatible. And what we tried to do at some point was to show them the whole compatibility graph and say, here are all the kidneys that could be proposed for your patient. Why don't you look at them now and tell us which ones you won't take? And that was just too hard to do, too big a problem to look at many kidneys that would probably never get proposed for your patient. So what we have been able to get them to do is indicate thresholds. Given the current health of your patient, what's the oldest donor you would take? What's the heaviest donor? What's the highest blood pressure? What's the worst creatinine clearance level? And they can answer these thresholds given the current health. The trouble with that, of course, is we then offer them something that meets all those conditions and they still reject it. And they say, when you ask them what's going on, they say, well, I said I would take a kidney from someone as old as 65, but I was hoping for someone as old as 65 in perfect health. You've shown me a guy who is 65, a little overweight, a little high blood pressure, but I put all my thresholds high so that you'd show me lots of kidneys because I'm looking out for my patient, but he's doing pretty well right now. No thank you on that kidney. So we were still getting very high. So it's hard to get their preferences in advance. Thresholds aren't quite doing it. What we've started to do is run, many of these optimizations have multiple solutions. We've started to show them now very small sets of kidneys. Here are 3 or 4 kidneys that might tomorrow be proposed for your patient. Can you tell us which ones you wouldn't take? And that helps. But it's still a complicated process to assess their preferences. And I think that's part of this engineering business, which is that the details matter. The details will be different in different problems. And what we normally value about theory, what we've historically valued about theory, is it should be general and elegant. But engineering solutions require details and accuracy as well. So market design is a collaborative and outward-facing part of economics. Let me flash before your eyes some of the papers on kidney exchange to emphasize not just the collaborations, but the journals, right? So here's a set of papers that are in journals that all have economics in their title. But you can't implement kidney exchange by just talking to economists. So here's another set of journals that all have medicine or transplantation in their titles. And part of market design, part of economic engineering, is that we're going to have to learn to talk to non-economists as well as economists about the things that we would like to help them do. Because it turns out that not everyone automatically thinks of economists as fellow members of the helping professions. So, if we're going to think of market design as economic engineering, we have to think about how theory and practice interact. And of course, the old joke says that in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. So science and engineering aren't exactly the same, but they complement each other. The science guides the engineering, and the engineering throws up new questions. So there's lots of new theory that we've developed in matching theory that comes from the practical problems of economic engineering. But also, science and engineering work on different time scales. So I'm coming back to the quote from the Budish paper that said, we don't claim this is optimal. When you prove a mathematical theorem, it's true forever. You know, Pythagoras' theorem is about both modern and ancient right triangles in Chicago and in Cambridge and in California and in China. But when you build a bridge, you know, here's a picture of two bridges. One of them was built 2,000 years ago in Rome, and it's still standing. So it was and is a great bridge. And the principles of physics that cause that bridge to stand up are the same physics that cause modern bridges to stand up. But modern bridges look very different. We've gotten better at building bridges. And we need better bridges, because after you build bridges, people change their behavior. They start coming into town more, so you need bigger roads, and then you need bigger bridges. You build the early bridges in easy, short spans, and the later bridges need longer spans. So engineering is not immutable. We're not trying for timeless solutions. But I think that might be the future of, one of the futures of economic theory. Thank you.
We're talking about the role of economic theory. I think I'd like to start briefly. I want to talk about timeless. Economic theory is timeless. That's the word. Nihans had a history of economic theory in which he tried to break all of economic theory into three parts. The early part, ending with around Ricardo, is about really the theory is based on flow balance and no arbitrage conditions, the linear algebra of commodities. And then his middle time is which I forgot what his term of, the marginalist revolution, but it was really about introducing individual rational choice in the 19th century and early 20th century, individual rational choice to explain the supply and demand curves that are about determining the market equilibrium for commodities. What he called the third age was in the 20th century till today is he called it the age of models, but really what was going on is individual rational choice methodology being expanded beyond commodity market clearing. So from that perspective, the questions of what do you get from rational choice and aggregate net demand curves, Hugo, thank you for the statement on that. Obviously, I want to interpret what Nihans called the age of models. I've got the floor for a few minutes. The age of game theory. No, game theory isn't all of it, and Gary Becker could manage to do it without and make sure it wasn't called game theory, but it was rational choice analysis extended far beyond traditional markets. That's fine, but let me say, and we're not here not to date ourselves, that you know, from our perspective, I think we're all of roughly the same generation. Hugo was editor of Econometrica from 1977 to 1984. This was a period when so much of game theory, of understanding models, of transactions between people who have different information, just blossomed and led to new applications. What an important period. And I want to say, by the way, in the cultivation of game theory, I have observed, and others had, well, Dillip had too much to say during his, because he had in his time about technical, so I can take the moment to say, I was, of course, one of the many who learned an enormous amount from Hugo, that was cultivated and encouraged in my career, even though until recently we were not colleagues. I was not his student, but still he just cultivates people. But I've talked to that long string of great game theorists who came out of students at first at Princeton and some also at Chicago. The long string of great game theory students who studied with Hugo. And I know from several different testimonies that part of the secret was that he could say with a straight face that he wasn't a game theorist and explain it all to me, and he'd get them to do great work in game theory. And thank you for that. But I think about the state of microeconomic theory today should be traced by its textbooks, Moskale, Winston, and Green. I think that at least one of the authors was heavily influenced by Sonnenshine's teaching of graduate micro, and Jaley and Rainey. Jaley and Rainey you guys have had new editions. Moskale, Winston, Green have not had any new editions since the early 90s. Have things, you know, the development of rational choice, of fundamental methodology in game theory and other kinds of rational choice analysis of complex situations that we didn't understand how to analyze before, in our lifetimes, before the lifetime of people here to some extent, and the professional lifetimes, and it will continue after. But one should hope that eventually there'll be some deceleration in the progress in fundamental game theory. I've co-authored a paper with Phil Rainey that he's presenting tomorrow on fundamental game theory methodology, but if there's less of that going on than was going on in the 70s and 60s to 90s, that's not a bad thing. As I said, I just cited some textbooks that came out in the 90s, and one would like those textbooks not to be able to have some staying power. For that analytical methodology, while it has more progress to make, should be rather slow. On the title of the role of economic theory, I want to assert, please, there are huge social questions and problems we manifestly do not yet understand well enough, and there is much more work to be done, and there are new tools that have existed that didn't exist a few generations before. My favorite quote would be from Rocher and Freisch's book on the microeconomics of banking. The first edition, I think, is published in '97. It says 20 years ago, so I think they're referring to 1970s. They say 20 years ago, we couldn't have had, meaning 1977, there couldn't have been a microeconomics of banking because banking is about asymmetric information. Banks banks exist essentially because they have, now I'm not quoting them, they may have said it better, but banks exist because they have better information about investments than their depositors, and therefore the transactions of banking are intrinsically, among other things, about people having different information. And if you don't have the analytics of transactions between people who have different information, an analytics which was unavailable, for example, to John Maynard Keynes or to Milton Friedman in his heyday of macro theorizing, then you can't really talk intrinsically about what banks are doing there. And very quickly in the early 80s, finance people started learning how to use the tools of asymmetric information. I think we were complacent in the stability of a financial system was something we knew how to do for a long time, so maybe we haven't reworked macro theory. But clearly we have tools, and clearly there are questions. I'd like to say, in terms of timeless, I think questions about the foundations of institutions, questions about the foundations of the state. Let me tie macro and the state together. In Reinhardt and Rogoff's book on this time it's different, of taking a broad perspective on business cycles, they suggest, without creating a theory, they suggest that we should see something in common between currency debasements in the Middle Ages, sovereign default, both to the citizens or to the foreigners, hyperinflation, inflation, and banking crises. What are they seeing in common? It all has to do with very important leaders, whether political leaders or financial leaders, but very important leaders of a society large groups in society losing trust in some of the most important leaders, or some of the most important leaders in some ways cheating the broader public of transactions of values, of hyperinflation or default on debt, on sovereign debt. Do we have models? I don't know. I was going to say, who's got a good model in which all of those look the same, that in which the unity of Reinhardt, I'm not sure if we have anyone yet, but I guess what I want to say most is that I think what game theory and other incentive constraints and other applications of rational choice methodology have taught us, the initial simplification that economic theory comes from, the great simplification of price theory, was that everything was in terms of commodities, the prices, a vector of prices. If you've got billions of commodities, because they're so finely distinguished, then of course that's still complicated. But if we can approximate the world by labor and capital and maybe land and maybe an interest rate over time between today and tomorrow, there aren't that many prices, and there can be millions of people, and you really can make very useful statements within price theory. As I say, liberating rational choice theory beyond just determining the supply and demand curve, beyond the formidable task of understanding supply and demand curves that could determine prices in a competitive market, liberating it to think about more generally about how people make rational choices in more complex transactions, gets us, I think, first and foremost to trust, the problems of trust. We heard from John this morning, John Giannakopoulos, about just introducing trust into certain very simple, still transactions, contingent commodity transactions, forcing a certain collateral leads to much deeper understanding of some aspect of financial crises. I've tried to argue in a paper that backloaded moral hazard rents can be a source of macroeconomic instability when nothing else is going on in the economy except for the fact that people have long careers and for reasons of trust, of agency, that they're being promised large end-of-career rewards whose value appreciates to them, whose motivational value appreciates to them during their career. But let me just end by saying, as someone who also works in political science, I want to talk the role of economic theory as timeless, understanding all institutions, including government, the structure of government. We can understand competition in politics as we understand competition in markets. And I've suggested for the maximal imperial scope within the social sciences that we could divide the problems of social theory into what I call greater psychology and greater economics. Greater economics being about, greater psychology, to put it aside, being about helping individuals to be better. So for therapy or for pedagogy, that's greater psychology. And greater economics is about developing understanding that can help us to get ready for questions of reform of institutions, economic engineering, writ large and abstracted, and for that, understanding how to build how changing the rules of markets affects behavior, changing how the structure of incentives and corporate governance rules, political rules, how constitutional rules affect our society. That's the greater mission of psychology. That maybe eventually will glean out all the insights available from current analytical technology, but I think there are many generations of work to be done on that.
Well, the topic of this panel, in my view, is not purely academic. I dare in a conference in honor of Hugo and take the risk to be a little emotional and say that behind the questions that Hugo posed, lies a very fundamental, huge question, which is, what's the meaning of our life? What's the meaning of our professional life, at least? What's the value of what we are doing? A response to such a question must be personal one, and my comments here will be completely personal. It so happens that in the last few weeks when I was preparing these comments, I was also writing a piece for Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, which touches the meaning of my life as an Israeli. And to be honest, to me, the two issues combine or overlap because they raise the same type of questions. Are we doing with our lives the right things? Are we devoting ourselves to what we believe in? Or are we just following the herd and addicted to comfortable life that profession gives us? Any honest answer to these questions will be quite loaded, charged. People, and me included, tend to be quite emotional when even the slightest doubt raised about regarding the value of what they are doing. So let me just clarify that whatever I think and say, I fully acknowledge the fact that there are here and there in the world many respectable, deep and sincere people who differ with me. I respect their views very much. I would rather present, the truth is that I would rather present in this conference a new paper than talk about my view about economic theory. But Hugo asked me to participate in the panel, and nobody can refuse Hugo, at least not me. So here I am, any blames to Hugo. In my mind, I divide economic theory into two classes. There are abstract models, and there are meta-discussions of models. So Nash bargaining solution or Nash demand game are models. Nash equilibrium existence result is discussion of models. Here and there, I was interested in the second part of economic theory, but most of my life, at least, I was interested in the first category, namely building or thinking about new models. What is a good model? A good model for me is a good story, just a good story. A good story about what? About the interaction between human beings, not computers, not bees, human beings. To emphasize this point, I start any course that I give in intermediate micro in Tel Aviv. I start by reading a story by Chekhov entitled The Nanny, the Nini. The story is about a man who plays a trick on the nanny he employs in order to teach her not to be a wimp when she is exploited by an employer. When I come to the end, to the beautiful, moving paragraph, the last paragraph of the story, my voice is always quivering. No, I don't quiver when I read a paper in Econometrica. But sometimes I get a sense of wonder when an interesting story emerges from the symbols. By the way, most of the students will, in a few years, remember from my course only the Chekhov story. Of course, they will forget the course materials that we will never use. Whether or not they accept the very relevant message of Chekhov's story, of course, I don't know. So I judge a story with I judge with the help of questions like, is it interesting, beautiful, original, clever? But not every sophisticated, original, and clever story is of interest, at least to me, because it has to somehow touch our lives. And I think the same is true about economic models. I like a formal model when an interesting, beautiful, original, clever story about our life emerges somehow from the symbols. There are many books in the library. There are many paintings on the same. There are many paintings on the same theme in the museum, and there can be many models about a similar scenario. Personally, I never use the term "the model." I always use the term "a model." And by the way, I also dislike the word economic theory, the term economic theory, which sounds to me too scientific. I would prefer to call economic theory a collection of economic stories or fables. I often heard colleagues of mine saying that we have already the models and the tools, and all we need is to apply them. This is analogous in my mind to saying that we have enough books in the library, and the only thing that we have to do is to read them. If theorists would invent new stories instead of revisiting the same model again and again and again, then economic theory will flourish. If theorists keep producing 150 pages papers on the same type of models, economic theory will fade. A story is not a tool for prediction. At most, it can help us to realize that a particular outcome is possible. This is how I view a modern economic theory. Personally, by the way, I don't have any urge to predict anything. I dread the moment, and which hopefully never arrive, when academics, and therefore also governments and Facebook and Google, will be able to predict human behavior with accuracy. The world will then be very different than the world that we live at, and I'm not sure that it will be a better one. Stories are not supposed to be useful in the sense that most people use the word useful. Economic theory is useful in the same sense that Chekhov's stories are useful when they inspire new ideas or clarify conceptual or emotional confusion. I will dare to say here that during 40 years more or less in the profession, I have never encountered a case in which I was fully persuaded, and I'm careful in my word, that economic theory can be directly used. In particular, I don't believe that any game theoretician, not even Orman, is entitled to give advice in strategic situations based on game theory. Any advice that a game theoretician gives will be no more useful than of any clever person without any knowledge of game theory, but who have intimate knowledge of the situation. I think that there is confusion among the public, also probably among ourselves, between the abilities of theoreticians and the power of the theory itself. Our community includes many brilliant people, and some of them have both feet on the ground. This is a rare combination, and such people can come up with interesting ideas and original ideas, which sometimes also make sense. But I'm not convinced that advice from these people would be less useful if it was based less on economic theory and more on intimate knowledge of the situation. Economic theory is like philosophy and literature, is part of culture and the public discourse, especially in that it requires also some degree of precision. And personally, I prefer to live in a society where such discourse occurs and is a part of the academic training rather than in a society where universities churn out useful human robots. A story is not testable, but when we read a story, we ask sometimes whether it is connected to reality. In doing so, we are essentially trying to assess the reasonableness of the basic scenario from which the story develops, and not whether the end of the story is true. For example, I can imagine an interesting love story about a Jewish man and a Palestinian woman who meet as students at the Hebrew University, marry and raise a happy family, even if this has never happened, and even if the variable being a Jewish Israeli man's wife is negatively correlated with the variable that the wife is Palestinian. On the other hand, I would not read a story about an Israeli man meeting an Arab woman while serving in a combat unit in the army, since this is, of course, impossible from the start. Similarly, I think that it's true about economic models. I would probably, if anything is to be tested, then it is the assumptions rather than the conclusions. The whole issue, by the way, reminds me of a personal traumatic experience that involved Hugo. In the mid-80s, yesterday, we were attending a winter conference in mathematical economics at Overwolfach in the Black Forest in Germany. Second day of the conference, Hugo approached me with some notes in which he and a group of his students reported on an experiment that tested a version of the alternating offers model. I was shocked, not by the results. Rather, it was the first time in my life that I realized that there are people in the world who think that game theory can be tested. Stories don't have concluding sections. Can you imagine a Chekhov story having a concluding paragraph which includes a summary of the message, a list of applications, and probably also suggestions for further stories. I feel the same about concluding sections in economic theory. In the last few years, some of you have seen me performing it. I am conducting a solo campaign against conclusion sections in economic theory. I end each lecture of mine with 2 slides. One carries the title Conclusion, 3 dots, and is empty. The other presents a photo I've taken a few years ago in Iceland of, I think you call it a stile. It's a fence which allows humans to cross and not cows. These are the conclusions. Concluding sections, usually in economics, contain a plethora of baseless statements about the world and dreams about applications, and they are part of the professional conventions and often force the authors often are forced on authors by referees and editors. The suggestions for further research are usually either trivial or constitute a mechanism to establish ownership. In any case, I would like to see those concluding sections cut out completely, or at least, they should not be forced on authors. Before I end, I would like to use this very rare opportunity to comment on something which is very important in my mind and very critical for the future of economic theory. I constantly ask theoreticians, both young and old, mature, how many papers they actually read last year in Econometrica, the leading journal of economic theory. I ask them to exclude papers as they referee. The answer is usually 0. Reading papers in economic theory become an ordeal. A small amount of substance is lost in tons of symbols and math. A point that can be essentially demonstrated using an example is developed into a complicated model. Many authors admit that, not publicly, that this is the only way to get a paper published. The length of the papers is also unbearable. I've said it many times, and I still don't believe that there is any paper in economic theory that requires more than 15 pages in print, including proofs and references. The new practice of relegating proofs to the appendix is another severe problem. The story of economic model is very often in the proofs, and therefore putting in the appendix is just like telling the headline without the story. Furthermore, the practice leads authors, of course, remember that all of us are also economic agents, so the practice leads us to develop less attention to simplify and validate proofs. In any case, nobody is going to read them. The insistence on extensive robustness checks is one of the other reasons for the length of the papers. But would you expect Chekhov to check whether his story in Russia rings also relevance in a diner in New York or a gas station in Pakistan? We are stuck in a very bad equilibrium. We are probably the wrong people to make a change because we have achieved success within the current system and we are economic agents. But hopefully we are not a guild, and therefore let me use this opportunity to call for a dramatic change in the industry of publication. We need to move to very short, readable papers with less mathematical sophistication and more originality, papers that will focus only on the main idea and to stop demanding the so-called applications. So, what do I honestly enjoy about economic theory, you asked? So let me finish by saying that when I was a very sincere, honest answer, when I was a child, I would play all day on the floor of my home in Jerusalem with what you call here Lego. In Hebrew, it was called Wonderstones. With Lego, you build models. The symbols are, for me, like Wonderstones. The formal models are the Lego constructions. There are no miracles. No truth is revealed on the floor with Lego and not near a desk by economic models. What gets me personally excited about economic theory is just the hope of experiencing a few more wonders similar to those that I experienced on the floor in Jerusalem with Wonderstones.
Okay, our cleanup batter is Lars.
Cleanup is the wrong term here. I was very pleased that the first statement in our charge was the introduction of mathematics and the more formal approach has helped to advanced economics. The other three panelists have interpreted this as economic theory, I believe, and I want to interpret it more broadly. My colleagues at the University of Chicago teach a seminar about how to think like a theorist, and I think it's a very powerful seminar for our students. I'm quite sure that I would not succeed at it, and I'm quite sure that my papers would not qualify as candidates within that no doubt very important seminar. However, I do believe that mathematics has played an important role in research that I value, and arguably for a little bit different reasons or complementary reasons to some of what's been discussed here. So I think of mathematics and this more formal approach as delivering on two different things that are intimately connected, of course. Mathematics serves as a language. It takes arguments that it adds rigor to a certain set of arguments. It makes us think more clearly about how to get conclusions from maintained assumptions. It helps us understand, that better arguments are when there's some distance between the assumptions and conclusions. It imposes clarity and it enhances communication. I would even go so far as to say it makes criticism easier rather than harder once you lay out the formalism. So, like when I've been, interested in the question of, say, looking at financial market data, how can we learn about investors' preferences or risk aversion? How can we learn about their risk exposures? All this mediated through market structures and the like. The formal approach allows clarity in that whole form of analysis that I view as just absolutely critical. There's a second thing it does too, though, and that is it opens the door to quantification. It allows us to incorporate formally data, to use that data in a very systematic way. It opens the door to model assessment, and it opens the door to quantitative prediction. Hugo's own work on demand systems was kind of remarkable, no doubt, as a piece of theory. It was also remarkable as a paper studying the observability or the observable implications of general equilibrium theory. When Bob Lucas and Tom Sargent were defending new approaches at the time of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models against some naive criticisms about how they obviously had to be empirically wrong, Hugo's theorem could be as like evidence about how it's not that easy to dismiss this whole class of models. And in many respects, it sets the stage to thinking like an econometrician in a sense about, when we're looking at structures that are testable, where's that coming from? What are the sources from it? Given that we know if we push it to its great generality, that there's that the testability becomes removed. So I think there's an example in which the formalization I think has just been many examples where the formalization and clarity has been just really vital and important. Now let me kind of go one step a little bit more controversial here. We have the Dean of the Social Sciences here, David Nirenberg. There's a building that he has an office in called the Social Science Research Building. This is the building that has long housed the economics department. It even for a while housed the Coles Foundation in what I would view as its intellectual heyday, in which mathematics, the early stages of the application of mathematics to both statistics and theory were explored. Unfortunately, it had an awkward ending to it, which is unfortunate, certainly to us at Chicago. But on the building, in the description of the Social Science Research Building, is a quote from Lord Kelvin. See, I can see the smoke coming out of your ears already.
Oh, yeah.
Let me read the quote, just for fun here. Kelvin, I often say that when you can measure something that you're speaking about, express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge of it is meager and of the unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced the stage of science, whatever the matter might be. Now, that's a rather strong statement, and a rather, I think, in contrast to some of the other panelists here, and it's also much stronger than I myself would embrace. In fact, when that inscription was put in the social science building, there was some distinguished Chicago economist had found itself controversial in those days. There's a quote from Frank Knight that says, to which his response was, "If you cannot measure a thing, go ahead and measure it anyway." I think it was probably not a full embracement of Kelvin. From Jacob Beiner, it said, "And even when we can measure a thing, our knowledge will be meager and unsatisfactory." So a little bit more thoughtful response. Now, just to continue a little bit on this story, so Lord Kelvin himself got into a debate with Charles Darwin about the age of the universe. Kelvin trotted out his models, and I did some computations with him, and only missed by a factor of about 100 or so about the age of the universe, and in fact was remarkably wrong in his exchange with Darwin on this point. So it's not as if using models and quantifications is a remotely simple exercise to be doing, and Lord Kelvin himself definitely stumbled on it. But I still think it's an interesting ambition, and one that I personally would prefer us not to abandon. Now, part of this challenge was to be forward-looking, to make forecasts about the future. A lot of my recent research has been about the impact of uncertainty in forecasts and what happens when you understate the amount of uncertainty. I will go ahead with a forecast and I'll leave out the uncertainty, but let me assure you that it's substantial. So I thought about two things going forward that would be very relevant to the type of research that I find interesting and many others. As we go further down this line of observable implications of dynamic general equilibrium models and try to develop them into computational tools or quantitative tools, more and more of what's happening is we're using computational methods to make the assessments. So we had a nice talk with John Giannakopoulos in which the volume of material per unit time was, of course, at a very, very incredibly high speed. And John himself was advocating that these are the type of ideas that ought to be imported in much more into macroeconomic models, which I would certainly be receptive to and find interesting. But on the surface, that models themselves weren't exactly ready for full quantification, and to take them to the next step would certainly require substantially more effort and no doubt more computational horsepower. Of course, our computational abilities have expanded substantially. Even highly structured dynamic models often do not have fully robust predictions, and there's this aim in which we use computers to try to sort out ranges of parameters or parameter configurations that might produce alternative outcomes. This is a practice that has been going on. I expect it's going to go on more in the future. I also think that to date it's been it has way too often reduced to a black box. We kind of write down a model, we push the computer buttons, we produce some output, and we're not fully happy with or not fully have a full set of understandings with these type of analyses. At least I don't. And part of the issues are twofold: assessing computational accuracy and producing illuminating sensitivity analyses. And so, I think how to do this better going forward can be tremendously rewarding. I think we don't know how to do it yet, but I think it's not. This is a line of research that I don't expect to disappear, and so this is like so-called theory on a computer, which I'm sure will horrify half of the audience here. But the fact of the matter is, this is a type of practice that's already being done, and I expect it to be done more and more in the future. A lot of the models that we analyze, we just can't do them by paper and pencil. Maybe we can look at stylized versions of them, and maybe the combination of highly stylized models with more computationally ambitious ones will be fruitful. I've had some exposure trying to understand better climate science models. They're incredibly complex. To me, they appear like a complete black box. My interest in them was to try to understand how to put quantitatively interesting connections between economic models and climate models that kind of recognize the appropriate amounts of uncertainty. And it's a very, very hard task. In fact, those models to me look very much like black boxes. The challenge about how to take models using computers in sensible ways and make them less black boxes and more transparent, along with thinking clearly about, maybe modeling counterparts to be, maybe more stylized counterparts, I think can be a very, very useful exercise, and one that I hope gets developed more in the future. There's another line of research that has attracted an extensive amount of interest on college campuses among many of our very smart undergraduates and elsewhere. Machine learning and big data. This is a situation in which we initially appeal to computers, algorithms, sometimes guided by formal statistics, to reveal interesting patterns in the data. New data sources have become available. More advanced computational methods allow one to proceed. This is absolutely required to be sensible, some type of guidance from formal statistical analysis in order to be really credible, I believe. But it's a really let the data speak type of approach. And I personally do not expect data richness alone to speak on all relevant matters. Rich new data sets are coming available. They're going to tell us some things, but they're not going to be able to answer all the questions we want on their own. I view it as important ambition as part of quantitative economics is to study so-called counterfactuals or implications for policy design. And I still think this is an essential formalism. I really don't see how you can really just go and let the data speak and be able to address all the full range of important questions that we as economists should be thinking about in terms of public policy. So what I think is potentially very interesting here is, will these new data sets at the same time make us be thinking about new classes of economic models, perhaps well suited to help us use these data in ways that are much more interpretable for our purposes. I think that this could be an incredibly exciting adventure. Let the data speak approach has, I think, limited value. It's interesting, but I think it'd be valuable to see how we take that to a new dimension. And let me kind of appeal by analogy. If we go back to the early 80s, Bob Lucas, Tom Sargent, Ed Prescott, and others were pushing for microeconomic underpinnings of macroeconomic models. One reason to have done this would have been for theoretical elegance, that yes, it's really nice to have these micro-founded models, and people in macroeconomics often brag about their micro-foundations. But part of it was the fact that at that point in time, a bunch of rich new data sets of microeconomics were becoming available, and that made it all the more attractive to build these microeconomic underpinnings in order to see how to bring these microeconomic data to bear on macroeconomic questions. As new data becomes available in this new data-rich environment, maybe it may well push us for modifications in the actual models that we build, and in ways that could be, I think, could be fully intriguing. So that's it for my prediction. So thank you.
Okay, well, I'll start by just asking Al. I mean, I very much like the idea of the economist as engineer, and I think, if you scratch almost any economist of any stripe, you have a social engineer of some sort. We all want to make the world a better place, and some of your research, I would say, it's had that impact very directly. I look at other fields, like, I don't know, public finance. And it's just, you look at the US tax code, and you look at, like a first year, microeconomic theory book, and it's just like, we're optimal. Geez, we're not even, like, we're so, actual policy is made on the basis of, like, kind of nothing economically sensible. So do you have some ideas about, like, the range, I don't know. Why are the two fields so different?
Well, I guess engineers learn to build bridges before they learn to build airplanes. Airplanes turn out to be more complicated than bridges. Bridges you can understand with simple physics, and airplanes. And when in doubt, you can make, if your bridges aren't standing up, a good rule of thumb is you can make them stronger and heavier. And that doesn't work for airplanes. So,
fair enough.
So it may be that there are, easier problems and harder ones, and we start with the easier ones.
So Roger, you talked about the role of, economic theory and especially information economics in the financial sector. And that made me think, so we've just been through a big financial crisis, So suppose we go back to, like 1960, before information economics was thought of, all the economic, progress was yet to come. Does our financial services sector really service so much better now than it did then? I mean, there's a lot more products, there's a lot more trading, there's a lot more lots of things. On the other hand, like Paul Volcker has said, the last great invention in financial services was the ATM. I don't know. So has the economic theory really, I don't know, has it delivered something better in a society?
I feel I'm only recently better able to hypothesize as to why the financial system seemed more stable in the 1960s than it has in the past 20 years. And how do we understand that? To me, I think I'm going to guess the most among the various things, a lot of things. There was a deregulation. A lot of things changed over a period of time, over a period of a couple of decades, and something may have contributed to making the system more unstable. I think the single most important thing was the elimination of ceilings on interest rates on deposits, on checking accounts, and which in some sense became intractable during the stagflation period, when there was higher inflation. Something needed to be done. Different institutions evolved to run around the old rules. But in some sense, it seems obvious. Every economist understands. You regulate a price, you're creating all kinds of distortions. But wait a minute, there's a problem of trust in this industry, and we're having difficulty regulating capital. But when you have low interest rates, when you give these banks essentially a money pump that if they can get people, nobody cares where they deposit their money because it's all the same. But if people are going to deposit with your bank because you happen to have got the location and nobody wants to locate next door to you because they're not going to even split half of it, you've got people banking with you. Why would you want to take any risk of bankruptcy when you've got this perpetuity, which is essentially part of your the term charter value? It's part of your the capitalization. So there's an automatic a mechanism that maybe worked pretty well to make sure that banks had capital that was proportional to their deposits, but because of an interference with the market. I didn't understand that. All I knew was, first of all, I was pleased to be able to get more interest on my checking account personally, and as a student of economics at the time, we were removing a constraint on a price which can only do harm. Well, maybe it could do good if you substituted an effective capital regulation that would achieve the same goals as the interference with the interest price, but I don't know. And that's a difficult task. So I understand that better as a result of a more sophisticated theory. I also understand it better, of course, because there's been some history, and I saw the market blow up. I got some empirical. We all got grabbed by life, and I didn't predict the financial crisis before 2008. So, that doesn't prove we understand. I should say, by the way, Steve Stigler has an article, I don't know if you were quoting from it, on the words that are carved onto the social science building, but the words don't, the longer quote from Kelvin says if you can't, thinking about things quantitatively, even if without measurement, might be receiving Kelvin's blessing. And the larger quote, the shortened version just suggests if you're not measuring, you're not.
It is true that was in the building as a shorter version than the quote that I read. So that should be truth in advertising. Yeah. I gave the longer quote, which is
And by the way, one of Stigler's discoveries was that the little flowers are actually ellipses, indicating that the other was quoted. But I would agree that much of what we do is what we do as a theorist. Those of us who are theorists who have been shown to have an inability to deal with measurement, personal inability that is a fault. But I think we are telling stories. I think you're absolutely 100% right. I want you to, I start my first game theory course, my undergraduate game theory course, I start by take on the story of Cain and Abel and trying to retell it as a game model, and the language of the modern novel, the language of the narrative style of religious myth writing, the narrative style of game theory are all different, but they're about helping us to see people interacting with each other in ways that help us to understand the world better. But it is, of course, only suggestive. But a great theory, a great theoretical model should help the reader to imagine and the possibility of some relationships between cause and effect, and a dynamic of cause and effect in human relations, just as a great novel should.
I could talk about the financial thing, but I'm going to change the subject a little bit. Some people, theory goes in sort of cycles. In fact, in the 60s, some people thought that we were at a low point when actually it was the beginning of an incredible acceleration in theory. But it seems to me nowadays that the emphasis in most departments on theory is less than it was 15 years ago. There are less positions in theory, there's less money in theory. And if you look at the university as a whole, there's less money going into universities. Some governors are even trying to eliminate tenure. And I wonder if anybody sees a parallel between the country's impatience with academia and our profession's impatience with theory.
Gentlemen.
I would just say, I wish your and other schools would be more impatient with theory when we're competing with you for job candidates in theory. We only win a fraction of.
You know, the theory has played no role in finance and has led to no good. I think that, on the contrary, lots of things have changed in theory. You know, there are many finance people, like the guy who started Vanguard. He says the last good idea in financial theory was the mutual fund. So that was a very self-serving thing for him to say. So it's obvious that Wall Street has been transformed by theory and the idea of tranching, and you know, they're sort of trying to create aero securities, and the whole way of looking at the world has been influenced by theory, and most of the time that makes the world worse. But unfortunately, I mean, better. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Most of the time that makes the world better, but it's occasionally when you can. There are missteps where it makes it worse for the reasons that Roger said. You know, if you've got incomplete markets and you add a few markets, if you could add them all, you'd make the world better. But if you add a few of them, you can actually sometimes move the world in the wrong direction, because there's still some, and that a regulation is compensating for some missing market somewhere. And so if you don't take that into account, by suddenly unleashing new markets, you may be making things worse instead of better. So I think it just means that we have to be vigilant and pay attention to the whole, but it doesn't mean that theory and is making the world worse. I think 90% of the time, 99% of the time, it makes it better in finance as well as everywhere else.
Can I just follow up on what John just said? Since this is the Becker Friedman Institute, I don't know how many people here read Friedman's price theory of provisional text, but a long time ago, Friedman had a chapter in which he said, if you have a regulated or an industry in which the government has already interfered, a compensating regulation can be a very good idea. You know, in the banking sector, we have deposit insurance. As a result, there may be other things you want to do, because deposit insurance creates certain incentives. And if you forget the simple lessons and just learn the complex ones, things can get worse.
Okay, anyone else from the audience? Would anyone on the panel like to make a closing statement?
Let me just say that I think that I'm more than I'm interested in what will be the future topics of economic theory. I'm interested actually in what will not be the topics, because these are the topics that I would like to think about. I mean, there are topics that other people will work, they will work. I mean, so it's if there is any need to predict. By the way, I don't feel any urge to think about what will be the future of economics, what will be the topics in 10 years. They will be whatever they will be. And as I've said, if they have any incentive, it's actually the opposite, to predict what will not be the topic.
I think there's a lot to discuss, more than we have time for, about whether papers should have conclusions. This is a deep and very exciting issue that I look forward to more discussion on.
All right, this sounds like a good topic for the cocktail hour. So to thank our panelists.